Lecture 15, we saw that Aristotle's and St. Thomas Aquinas' understanding of virtue, that is, their understanding of human excellence, was based on identifying the proper function of the human person considered as such. Because the proper function of the human person is reason, it follows that what it means to be a good human person is to use one's reason well. That's why, as we saw, moral virtue depends on the extent to which our actions and our passions follow right reason. The person with the virtue of generosity, for example, gives of himself what right reason determines to be the right amount, to the right people, in the right circumstances, and so on. So our practical reason must first determine the right course of action, and then the will of the person must follow right reason in order to fully possess the moral virtue of generosity, and indeed all the moral virtues. But we also noticed in Lecture 15 that identifying reason as the proper function of the human person gives rise to another kind of virtue altogether. Not only is its reason's function to guide our actions and our passions, reason also has a function, we might say, of its own. And this function essentially boils down to the acquisition of truth. And because there exists this distinct function of reason, there also exists a distinct form of uniquely human virtue that Aristotle and St. Thomas call intellectual virtue. Now, coming to know the truth can mean different things. And so Aristotle and St. Thomas distinguish between different kinds of intellectual virtue, or different intellectual virtues. Specifically, there are 5 virtues which the human intellect is capable. They are the following: prudence, called prudentia by St. Thomas, and phronesis by Aristotle; art or technical skill, called ars by St. Thomas and techne by Aristotle; knowledge, called scientia by St. Thomas and episteme by Aristotle; understanding, called intellectus by St. Thomas and nous by Aristotle; and finally, wisdom, called sapientia by St. Thomas and sophia by Aristotle. The purpose of this lecture will be to explain these 5, to distinguish between them, and to understand how each perfects the human intellect in its own distinctive way. Let's begin with prudence. As St. Thomas explains, prudence is both a moral virtue and an intellectual virtue. But why is this so? Remember that the moral virtues are ultimately directed towards guiding our actions and our passions, though in many ways they guide our actions even in guiding our passions, since the ability to control our passions gives rise to performing some actions, for example, eating moderately, and avoiding other actions, for example, not committing adultery. On the other hand, as we just saw, intellectual virtues guide us in the discovery of truth. But this is precisely why prudence is both a moral and an intellectual virtue. The prudent person is able to use his or her reason to discover the truth about what ought to be done. This doesn't guarantee that the prudent person will necessarily do the right thing. Other virtues like moderation or fortitude might be necessary for that. But prudence is necessary for discovering the right course of action in a wide variety of situations. So, in deliberating well about what one should or should not do, we might say that the goal is to discover a certain kind of truth. But unlike the discovery of other kinds of truth, the knowledge gained by prudence is a knowledge specifically oriented toward action. So this again is why prudence is both a moral and an intellectual virtue. Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas are emphatic that one simply cannot be a good human being without prudence. Now, admittedly, this claim would strike many people today as strange, or even patently false. The reason for this, most likely, is because in modern times, and no doubt because of the influence of modern moral philosophy, and especially Immanuel Kant, the term prudence conveys the idea of a purely selfish skill. So many people nowadays think of the prudent person as the one who is skilled in a kind of selfish reasoning, knowing how to manipulate things and people for the sake of serving one's own interests. On this view, moral reasoning would be in some ways the antithesis of prudent reasoning, since by moral reasoning we go about discovering not what's in our self-interest, but what our moral duty requires. But on Aristotle's and St. Thomas Aquinas' moral philosophy, this understanding of prudence is flawed, just as the distinction between moral reasoning and prudent reasoning is, in the end, a false distinction. The prudent person on the Aristotelian and Thomistic view is not merely clever or cunning, and in fact morality requires us to be prudent in all our actions. Perhaps the best way to understand why Aristotle and St. Thomas take the view they do is because they would ultimately reject the premise that, in the end, there even is a distinction between acting for one's own benefit and acting morally. To be sure, this distinction is fine if we define one's own benefit in a kind of a purely selfish way, referring exclusively to one's immediate and materialistic advantage. As we've pointed out several times already in this course, when one takes one's ultimate good, one's ultimate happiness as one's highest aim, what is for our good and what morality requires just converge and become the same thing. So, for example, a merely clever man might possess the knowledge of how to cheat on his wife while preventing her from finding out. But the truly prudent man would possess the knowledge that committing adultery is an action to be avoided, not only because it's his duty to avoid it, but because committing adultery makes him a worse person, and thus prevents him from what he truly wants above all else, whether he realizes it or not, namely, happiness. So it's crucial to recognize that it's precisely because Aristotle and St. Thomas have a moral theory based on the concept of happiness as our ultimate goal, as opposed to, say, a morality based on obligation, like that of Immanuel Kant, that they place such a moral premium on the virtue of prudence, which again is partly moral because it guides our actions in accordance with our true good, but also partly intellectual because its immediate object is the truth about what ought to be done. The next intellectual virtue is art, or technical skill. And because the word art has such a different meaning in English, I will refer to it by its Greek name, what Aristotle calls techne. Techne is similar to prudence in that while its immediate object is a certain kind of knowledge, it belongs to the nature of that knowledge to be put into practice. What techne is primarily oriented toward, however, is not so much acting as it is making. So if the prudent person has what we might call practical wisdom, the person possessing techne possesses what we might call know-how. So the knowledge I might possess in how to build a house, play the piano, grow herbs, or carve tools out of wood would all be examples of techne. So techne would certainly include one's knowledge of the fine arts, such as playing music, painting, sculpture, or drawing. But it would also include purely practical skills as well. And in fact, these practical skills are what Aristotle and St. Thomas seem to have primarily in mind when they talk about techne. And so techne is a practical virtue, but not a moral virtue. And this makes perfect sense with a little reflection. It certainly requires techne to build weapons, but such knowledge completely leaves open the question as to whether one is willing to use those weapons in a morally good way or a morally bad way. It certainly requires techne to design an automobile, or a computer, or a modern-day city. But anyone can see that even the most brilliant engineers, rocket scientists, computer designers, and urban planners may or may not be good human beings in the morally relevant sense of the term good. Still, they possess a perfection that others don't. And because that perfection is rooted in their rational nature, it deserves esteem and should be recognized as the intellectual virtue it is. Next we have knowledge, or scientia, or as Aristotle calls it, episteme. And from the Latin scientia is derived our English word science. We must be very careful, however, not to think of the term scientia as equivalent to the modern understanding of science, which includes the idea of submitting hypotheses to risky testing through experimentation and ultimately leading to a possible scientific theory that can then be used to predict phenomenon in the physical world. Aristotle's view of science does not exclude these things, but we must understand that it is much broader and simpler. Probably the best way to think of the intellectual virtue of episteme is to think of what we might call a body of knowledge. For Aristotle and St. Thomas, a body of knowledge must correspond to some segment of reality. So a person with a knowledge of biology possesses knowledge of living things. A person with knowledge of physics possesses knowledge of the physical universe. And someone with a knowledge of ornithology possesses knowledge of birds. In distinguishing episteme from techne, Aristotle remarks that episteme has to do with things that do not admit of being otherwise, whereas techne does admit of being otherwise. This stems from the fact that techne originates in the human mind itself, so to speak. If I'm building a table, the form of the table I'm striving to build originates in and is supplied by me. I might build that table incorrectly, but it will only be incorrect if the finished product differs substantively from what was in my mind. But I may change my mind halfway through the project, or just decide not to build the table at all, or build something else. Episteme, or scientific knowledge, on the other hand, is not subject to change in the same way. If I'm studying physics, biology, geometry, or mathematics, I'm studying some aspect of reality of which there already exists an objective fact of the matter. My knowledge of these subjects, accordingly, is only genuine knowledge if what was in my mind accurately corresponds to that objective fact of the matter. In geometry, I cannot change my mind about the properties of a triangle and still have knowledge, as I can change my mind about what sort of table I'm going to build and still have techne. It may seem strange to some that knowledge so construed is considered a virtue by Aristotle and St. Thomas. What does the brilliant scientist's knowledge of chemistry, for example, have to do with whether that scientist is a good person? Doesn't being good as a human being mean something altogether beside the point of what bodies of knowledge one has acquired, whether it's in physics, chemistry, mathematics, or even philosophy and theology for that matter? This point is reasonable as far as it goes, but all it succeeds in doing is to point out a distinction already allowed by Aristotle and St. Thomas, namely that between moral virtue and intellectual virtue. When we speak of this or that person as a good person, what we're usually referring to just is the degree to which they possess moral virtue, whether they are generous, just, courageous, or self-controlled. We don't, in other words, usually mean how intelligent they are or how much knowledge they've acquired. But this doesn't mean that the acquisition of knowledge, or even the acquisition of technical skills for that matter, are not indeed still uniquely human perfections. Granted, the simple, pious, uneducated nun is morally superior to the brilliant scientist who cheats on his wife and abuses his children. But that brilliant scientist, one must nevertheless admit, does possess a perfection that the simple, pious nun does not possess. And because that perfection is rooted in his rational and uniquely human nature, we must still call it a virtue, an intellectual virtue. This brings us to the intellectual virtue that Aristotle calls nous, and St. Thomas calls intellectus. And to understand these, one must understand how they are related to what we just discussed as episteme or scientia. Recall that scientia is essentially a body of knowledge about a particular segment of reality. So those who gather knowledge of this kind or that kind do so by reasoning. That is to say, by deriving new knowledge about a particular field of study from what is already known. A good example of this is geometry or mathematics, which proceeds from postulates or theorems to discover the answers to additional mathematical questions. But one might ask, how are those theorems and postulates known to be true? The answer is probably that in some way they are derived from still more fundamental theorems and postulates. But as we will soon recognize, this process cannot go back to infinity, because then our knowledge just wouldn't really be based on anything known at all. And so what we call knowledge would, on analysis, really just be a sophisticated conglomeration of arbitrary beliefs. This is why Aristotle and St. Thomas argue that for every body of knowledge, there must be some set of first principles. That is, principles that are not derived from within that body of knowledge at all, but which are still known. They will be known, moreover, in one of two ways. Either they will be provable as conclusions from some other, still more fundamental science, or they will just be self-evident truths that don't need to be proven at all. In either case, Aristotle calls the knowledge of these first principles nous. St. Thomas calls it intellectus, which may simply be comprehended as the knowledge of principles. Again, the first principles of any science must either be supplied by some other science, or they must simply be self-evidently true, which means ultimately that there can be no such thing as knowledge at all unless there are some self-evidently true principles of which the human intellect can have knowledge as a kind of starting point. Knowledge of the highest and most fundamental first principles would naturally belong to the highest and most fundamental science, the science that deals with the most basic dimensions of reality. And as we saw all the way back in Lecture 6, this is what Aristotle and St. Thomas call metaphysics, or the science of being. Probably the ideal example of nous or intellectus, therefore, would be the philosopher's knowledge of the first principle of being, the principle of non-contradiction. Nothing can be and not be at the same time in the same respect. So I cannot be 6 feet tall and not 6 feet tall at the same time. A square cannot have 4 sides and not 4 sides at the same time and in the same respect, and so on. Of course, we might admit of verbal contradictions in different respects, as when someone might weigh 150 pounds on Earth and just 25 pounds on the moon. The knowledge one has of the principle of non-contradiction, though, is such a good example of nous or intellectus, not only because it's so foundational. If this principle can be doubted, then really everything is doubtful. But also for the fact that it's not derived or deduced from any other knowledge. One simply must see that it's true, that it has to be true. It's unprovable, not in the sense that it's arbitrary or accepted on faith, but because it is the self-evident truth from which all other knowledge is derived and on which that knowledge depends. This reference to metaphysics and the first principles thereof naturally leads to the final intellectual virtue recognized by Aristotle and St. Thomas, namely theoretical wisdom, called Sophia by Aristotle and sapientia by St. Thomas. This is perhaps the most elusive of all the intellectual virtues, but also in some ways the most important. If we say that a person possesses theoretical wisdom, what we mean by that, says Aristotle, is not that they have a knowledge of this or that aspect or part of reality. As we saw, that is episteme or scientia. But rather that they have a broader knowledge of reality as a whole, which allows them to understand how all of the sciences fit together, because they understand how all the parts of reality those sciences study fit together. Perhaps an analogy would be the aerial viewpoint someone might have of a small island nation. From the ground, a person might have knowledge of the farms, the forests, the villages, the cities, the lakes, the harbors, or the train tracks. But from the air, one is better positioned to understand how all these work in concert with one another so as to constitute the island, its infrastructure, its topography, and so on. From the air, in other words, the onlooker has a view of the whole. In analogous fashion, those possessing theoretical wisdom have an understanding of reality from the perspective of the whole as well. Not in the sense of seeing that whole with their eyes, as the man does from the plane, but in understanding the whole with respect to the first or most fundamental causes of things. This is why Aristotle tells us that, above all, the student of metaphysics, the science of being, is the person of theoretical wisdom par excellence. And St. Thomas would add to this that those who pursue an understanding of God, the first and highest cause of reality, likewise pursue a wisdom that is unsurpassable, and yet never fully achievable, at least in this life. Wisdom is something to be pursued, but never really attained, since the object of wisdom, ultimately God himself, is inexhaustible. Nevertheless, to the extent that we do pursue wisdom and make progress towards it, we advance in the perfection of our souls, which, as hopefully we've seen now, includes intellectual perfection in addition to moral perfection.